What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 5 of Digging Through the Gospel According to Mark. And here is our next intro session, just trying to lay down the context and the framework so that when we get into it verse by verse, it's all going to make sense and it's going to come to life and it's going to pop out at you and cause you and compel you to want to respond to the message of the gospel in which Mark is proclaiming and who he's portraying this Jewish Jesus to be. So let's get right into it. So Jesus and the law, the Torah, and what these conflicts were really about with Jesus as a rabbi entering the scene and with other Jews from different subsects of Second Temple Judaism. So one thing we need to start with is these weren't Jewish versus Christians arguments or Jesus versus the law debates or Jesus versus Judaism debates. One of the most common misreadings, and I'm going to say that again, misreadings, faulty, inaccurate readings of Mark is interpreting Jesus's conflicts with the Pharisees as Christianity or Jesus pulling away from Judaism. Meaning Jesus is dismantling or replacing this old religion, this old harsh, law-based, legalistic religion with something new. This is just demonstrably false, and this is not what it's saying. And this rendition actually gets it kind of backwards. So rather what we see, if we really care, is that these were internal intra-Jewish debates about how do we live this out? And this is the kind of debates that are happening constantly across various factions of Second Temple Judaism among Second Temple Jews. And then you have Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, Qumranites, all of these different little subsects of Jews all disagreed sharply with each other about Sabbath rules, purity practices, and how to apply the Torah in their current predicament. So Jesus was not stepping outside of that conversation. Rather, he was entering into it, and he was a forceful, authoritative voice within it, okay? Arguing for a particular set of priorities within the dialogue. And now, what are these priorities will become a key question that we will dig into as we move through the gospel. But just to kind of lay a foundation, one of them is about the Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath, not a Christian Sunday thing, but the actual ordinance from God from Genesis 1, recapitulated in Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, and a whole bunch of, Leviticus 23 and a whole bunch of other texts that are complete throughout the entire Hebrew Bible. The Sabbath is a big deal. Jesus loved the Sabbath. His apostles loved the Sabbath. Paul loved the Sabbath. Paul honored the Sabbath. And the prophets in the Hebrew Bible foretell of a horizon in which all of the nations would also honor the Sabbath and delight in the Sabbath. And we have in this age to come that we've been talking about, time on a weekly basis will be reckoned and measured from Sabbath to Sabbath. Interestingly, when Jesus goes to the temple, when he really offers a rebuke against the corrupt temple leadership, he quotes a passage from the book of Isaiah, the 56th chapter, when he says, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. And it's within this dialogue is when one of the most forceful and clear passages when the prophets say that all those who have joined themselves to Israel and the God of Israel, Yahweh, those are the foreigners, those from the nations will delight in the Sabbath, and God will prosper them and bless them. So when Jesus defends his disciples for plucking grain on the Sabbath, when they say that the Pharisees kind of question him and saying, why do they break the Sabbath, doing what is not permitted to do on the Sabbath? He's not coming against their dig. He's not coming against their interpretation of this being work. He appeals to the story of David eating the temple bread, the showbread, the bread for the priests. Only the priests were permitted to eat it. And he argues using a classic Jewish reasoning pattern called light to heavy, or the Hebrew was kal vahomer. And he says when David goes to the priest, he says that he's on a royally commissioned mission from King Saul, which gave the precedence for the overriding a cultic regulation in a situation of human need. In that human need, because he was on a divine mission, was able to override a contrary command. And so basically what you have here is in the Torah, right? If you have two commandments of God that conflict with each other, one of them has to be suspended or set aside, and the other one has to be adhered to. Might sound strange to us as Christians, but this is definitely the conversation that Jesus is having. And he totally validates and upholds and esteems the commands of God. So Jesus is essentially saying that his mission is even greater than David's, and his entourage, his disciples, his guys are on a mission to go to another synagogue to proclaim the gospel in Israel's prophetic restoration. This is so much greater than what David did in the book of Samuel, that allowed the Torah, the prohibition for that bread to be eaten by a non-priest. This is so much more significant, is what he's saying. What the Pharisees don't like is him claiming to be that guy, that eschatological agent. That's the problem. It's not the law, the debate of the law that they're saying. I bet that even the Pharisees, when he pulled that example of David, they probably would have agreed with him, actually. And so his summary statement, he says the Sabbath was made for mankind and not mankind for the Sabbath. It's not a dismissal of the Sabbath. This is 100% not saying Jesus is the Sabbath in some mystical and abstract way. Pardon me if I'm stepping on toes here, but I'm just trying to look at the text on its terms. Rather, it's a hermeneutical principle about how to properly order values within the Torah. Interestingly, later rabbinic tradition arrives at a remarkably similar conclusion through the principle of pikuach nefesh, which means the preservation of life. So think about this. Jesus and the rabbis were wrestling with the same conversation. They just arrived on different paths on how to express and live Torah. Okay? I hope that makes sense. But this is really important when we're really reading Jesus, so that we make sure that we're reading him within his context, and he's all about the commands of God. And Paul was too. Mark 7 is another one. It's a very frequently mishandled passage in this section, and it contains a parenthetical note in a lot of modern translations, and it's often translated as this, quote, "And thus he declared all foods clean," which has been, for pretty much everybody I know, most people I know, has been cited as Jesus somehow, in some way, abrogating or abolishing the dietary restrictions that are found in the book of Leviticus. However, that reading and interpretation misses the entire point of what the conversation and dispute's actually about. It's even questionable if that parenthetical statement should even be in there, because there's other Greek texts that don't have it. Anyways, this argument is not about Levitical food laws at all, actually. It's about a Pharisaic hand-washing tradition. So if you remember in one of our previous videos, we talked about how one of the things the Pharisees sought to bring to all the common man in Israel is priestly Levitical regulation to make sure that Israel was extra pure, right? So that they would not get vomited or exiled out of the land again for breaking the Torah. So only the priests were commanded to wash hands in the Torah, and so the Pharisees wanted to bring this to the household of every man. And this was a tradition of the elders. It was an extra biblical tradition that you won't find in the Torah. So this was a practice that they developed to extend priestly purity rules into everyday domestic life for ordinary Jews. This was not a Mosaic command. It was a scribal innovation, and a contested one even among the Pharisees themselves. And so certain of these Pharisees, now remember, all these dialogues of the Pharisees does not mean all of the Pharisees held these same ideas. This really was a hot mess in the first century. It's just the few, not the many. If we can remember that, it's very important. Jesus's objection is pointed, straightforward. when a human tradition gets elevated to the level of divine command, it can end up displacing the actual requirements of the Torah. And he uses this example of korban, which means offering. It's a Hebrew word, it means offering, and it's a legal formula that allowed someone to dedicate their assets to the temple while simultaneously using that vow as an excuse to avoid financially supporting their elderly parents. Okay? The Torah says to honor your parents. And so this tradition had created a workaround, and Jesus calls it out for wickedness and hypocrisy, actually, especially when the temple is corrupt. So, I mean, there's a lot happening here, but this is part of the dialogue, so I hope this helps. So, when Jesus then goes and says that defilement comes from within, from the heart, modern readers tend to hear a contrast, go figure, between external religion and inner spirituality. These are very Platonic ideas that these guys did not espouse or even think about. But that's a later Greek way of thinking about it. Okay? So in covenantal Jewish theology, the heart was the center of a person's will, their inclination to do what they wanted to, and a fundamental orientation towards God. So the language of Jeremiah 31 was the new covenant being written on the heart, or in Ezekiel 36, when God replaces the heart of stone with the heart of flesh. In Isaiah 29, honoring God with lips while their hearts were hard. Okay, Jesus is standing squarely in this prophetic tradition that consistently warns Israel. You can perform every external ritual correctly, but you can still be in fundamental violation of the covenant within your heart. Isaiah 1 is a great passage about this, the introduction to the book of Isaiah. Your actual orientation toward God and neighbor is corrupt, even though you do all these things. But if your heart is polluted on the inside, then this is the problem. This is what he's actually after. He's not dismantling the the prophets actually said repeatedly, Isaiah 1, Amos 5, Micah 6, Hosea 6, that sacrifice and ritual without justice and fidelity to God is actually not covenant faithfulness. It's mere performance. So Mark's Jesus is making the same argument in the same tradition. He's not dismantling the Torah. He's upholding the Torah. He's wielding the prophets against a version of Torah keeping that had become detached from the Torah's own deepest purposes and reasons. So think about this, guys. Let's reframe Jesus in his Jewish context as a rabbi who loves the Torah. And if we believe that he is God in the flesh, he's the one that gave the Torah. He's the one that wrote the Torah, and he's going to uphold it, and he's going to come in and be a voice that tells us how to live the Torah in light of the apocalyptic hope of the kingdom of God. And oftentimes it's in contrast with what he has a gripe and a grievance against, is the way other Second Temple Jews approach the same Torah with the same hope. Hope that helps, guys. Pretty interesting, and we're going to continue to build on this and get to the bottom of this so we can live in light of the coming kingdom. Blessings.